Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, Chapter 29. The Fruits of Former Civilizations and the Blossoms of the Contemporary. According to the associative flow of my tales concerning the three-brained beings breeding on the planet Earth who have taken your fancy, I must now, my boy, without fail, explain to you a little more about those two powerful communities there named Greeks and Romans, who made a clean sweep from the surface of that ill-fated planet of even the memory of the results obtained from the most saintly labors of the essence-loving Ashiata Shiyamash. I must tell you first of all that at that period, when on the surface of your planet, on the continent of Asia, there was actualized from above within the presence of a three-brained being, the already definitized sacred conception of our now omnicosmic, very saintly Ashiata Shiyamash. And later also, during the periods of his very saintly activities, and the subsequent gradual destruction by your favorites of all the results obtained from them. There also existed, on the neighboring continent, then already called Europe, great numbers of those strange three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, and who had already long before grouped themselves into various independent communities. Among the number of those independent communities, there were, during those periods, owing to those cosmic laws which I have once mentioned to you, those two large and, as they say there, most powerful communities, that is to say, well organized and possessing more means for the processes of reciprocal destruction, the Greeks and Romans. And about these, from the point of view of your contemporary favorites, very ancient communities, I must furthermore not fail to explain to you, and possibly in detail, because not only did they then, as I've already said, make a clean sweep from the face of that unfortunate planet of the last results beneficial for all the three-brained beings of all subsequent epochs, and even of all traces of the memory of the very saintly labors of the essence-loving Ashiata Shiyamash. But they were also the cause that real nonsense already proceeds in the reasons of the contemporary favorites of yours, and that there is completely atrophied in them that fundamental being impulse which is the main lever of objective morality, and which is called organic shame. A closer acquaintance with these big groupings of your favorites and with various forms of bliss prepared by them, and which have passed to the beings of later epochs, will give you a good idea and enable you to understand exactly how separate independent communities are formed there, and also how a given community, having become powerful quite independently of the beings themselves, takes advantage of the fact and sets about destroying everything already attained by the other less powerful communities, and forces upon them their own new inventions, in most cases sincerely imagining that they truly are just what the others need. I must warn you, my boy, that my story of the history of their arising and of everything later connected with those ancient communities called Greeks and Romans is not based on the results of my personal investigations. No, I shall only give you the information about them which I got from one of those beings of our tribe who wished to remain to exist forever on that planet of yours. The circumstances were these. In descending to the planet Earth for the sixth and last time, I proposed to attain at any cost the final elucidation for myself of all the genuine causes why the psyche of those three-brained beings, which should be like the psyche of the rest of the three-brained beings of our great universe, had on that planet become so exceptionally strange. and having during my investigations repeatedly constated that a fundamental cause of the various abnormalities of the general psyche of the contemporary beings was what is called civilization, sown by those two large groups of beings called Greeks and Romans, I was obliged to inquire into certain details about them also. But as I was fully occupied at that time with my researches concerning the activities of the very saintly Ajiata Shiyamash, I commissioned the elucidation of the history of the arising of these two independent groupings of your favorites in respect of what is called their subjective being, to that same being of our tribe who, as I've already told you, still carries on an undertaker's business in a large city on the continent of Europe down to the present time. From the investigations of this countryman of ours, it seems that long ago, before the period to which my tale about the majestic city of Babylon referred, namely, at the time when the process of the existence of those strange beings was proceeding mainly on the continent of Asia alone, and when their chief center of culture was Tikliamish, there were on that said continent of Europe, which is now the chief place of existence of your favorites, as yet no definitely organized communities. There then chiefly existed on that continent two-brained and one-brained beings called wild quadrupeds and reptiles. But of your favorites, the biped beings, there were then on that continent only a number of small groups, almost as wild as the quadrupeds themselves. The occupation of these small groups of biped beings was merely the destruction of the quadruped and reptile beings, and occasionally also of each other. And the numbers of your favorites on that continent Europe only increased when emigrants from Maral Plessis, wandering from one place to another, finally arrived and settled there. Towards the close of that period, there migrated from Tikliamish to that continent Europe a number of beings of the first Asiatic group who followed two quite distinct occupations. Namely, some of them were engaged in various marine occupations, and others in what are called their cattle raising and sheep farming. The cattle raising families populated chiefly the southern shores of the continent because those parts were at that time very convenient for the maintenance and grazing of such quadruped beings. And that group of terrestrial beings was then called Latinaki, a word that signifies shepherds. At first, these shepherds existed with their families and flocks scattered in different places, but later on their numbers gradually increased, partly from the immigration of beings from the continent Asia having the same occupation as themselves, and partly because they were becoming more and more prolific, owing to the fact that the nature of the planet Earth was beginning to adapt herself to the deteriorating quality of the vibrations she demanded, that had to be formed from their radiations, by substituting those vibrations which are now obtained only from the process of their sacred raskuarno, or as they say, from their death. And thus, when, thanks to all this, their numbers had considerably increased and external conditions demanded frequent relations between separate families, they formed their first common place. And this common place they called Rimpk.